Just shared it.
Great. Because, whoops, sorry. There we go. All right. So I was introduced by Moira. I'm Ann Whiteside. I'm Assistant Dean for Information Services at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. And Sarah Rogers is our digital archivist, and Stephen Abrams is the head of preservation for Harvard Library. And we want to, as I said, we want to talk about that. And so what we wanted to do today primarily is to focus on our recommendations related to legal issues of donations, the idea of a model template for deeds of gift, and working with the American Institute of Architects on this. We also are interested in talking about how to make best practices and what role SAA can play. And we want to talk a little bit about transfer guidelines we developed and making those best practices. And also talk about implementation of some of the legal recommendations, and also how we can engage together in the education of design students around the preservation of their born digital files as they start off as students. So I'm going to do a quick overview of the work that the timeline, and then I'm going to turn it over to Stephen and then to Sarah. And I hope you see the next slide. So I won't take too long to do this, but in 2018, we held a national forum sponsored by our IMLS grant in conjunction with the Society for Architectural Historians annual conference. And we had architects, architectural historians, archivists, librarians, technologists, digital preservationists, and others talking about what is needed to create a sort of collaborative infrastructure, meaning maybe technological, but also human infrastructure to support the long-term preservation of digital design data with the specificity of born digital in the work. The outcome was a plan that really, when I looked at it later, it's really like a strategic plan. I mean, it's 5 or 10 years worth of work, but it included a multifaceted list of projects and tasks associated. In 2019, we started talking with the CAD being a very large, broad spectrum of vendors of software, and broad spectrum name for software vendors, vendor representatives through a series of interviews where we talked about the software development process, interoperability of the software, exportability of file types, the ability to use free readers of the software, how they might archive their software, and what they were thinking themselves about the future of their software products. This allowed us to understand the perspective of the vendors and to start to identify where we might find common places to connect with vendors, designers, and archivists. We also started something that came out of the forum as well, which was 2 pilot projects with the SAA Design firm and the Howler and Yoon architecture firm, which are both in Boston, working with in-process design projects. And much of that work happened just before the pandemic. And during that time, we focused on learning about how the designers work on their projects, how they collaborate with colleagues, particularly because Sasaki and Howler and Yoon were collaborating on a project. And also learning about the generation and sharing of the data files they produced. And that helped us understand also how we might think about preservation with some different lenses. And a lot of the intellectual issues rose to the surface in those conversations. Intellectual property issues rose to the surface. In 20 and 21, we had another extension from IMLS due to the pandemic. And so we focused on developing preservation recommendations that address the preservation of the objects, but also the ability to experience those files appropriately to the software from which they were created. And we investigated intellectual property issues in collections of design records and the impact on the eventual collecting institutions. We also came up with a long list of further recommendations on many different aspects of the work involved in archiving digital files. Some examples include transfer requirements to get the data files from the firms to the collecting institution, work that we can do to ensure that we can provide access to researchers to these files going forward, further work on the intellectual property issues, because we felt we made a really good start and there's some more work we can do, and work on educating students before they go out into the professional world. And the reason we were interested in that is one of the things we heard from the designers is, we get all these newly graduated people and they're really great, except they have no clue how to manage any data files. And we have to do boot camps and we have to teach them and we have to start all over. And so that was an interesting outcome that we weren't totally expecting. So I'm now going to turn this over to Stephen. And Stephen, you can tell me when to change slides.
Sure. Thank you, Anne. And hello, everyone. Echoing Anne's opening statements, we're so glad to have this opportunity to talk with you and I think to learn from you and gain from your experience working in this field. Certainly for me, I'm much more of a generalist in the preservation world, and I know I've learned so much from Anne and Sarah with their own specialized knowledge. So to begin with, the initial phases of work in the 2019-2021 timeframe were spent on trying to put into place, to begin with, to put into place a framework for the development of a series of recommendations that we wanted to make out to the field. And this, we had somewhat of this sort of high-level structure with these sort of three main questions, research questions in mind. The first, of course, is what is it that we think we should be doing in order to collect, to preserve, and to make available these important cultural, historical, artifacts of architectural and engineering importance. Secondly, what do we have the technical capability and the capacity to do? We were looking for things that we knew how to do, that we had appropriate processes, policies, systems for doing, but also trying to identify areas where there was additional function, additional tools that we thought would make this job go a lot easier in future. And then finally, the very thorny question of what do we have the legal right to do beyond what we have the ability to do. And I'm sure we all know that there's just, this stuff is just so completely entangled in a variety of legal issues, and particular that individual, the collaborative nature of the design activity just really makes it even that much more difficult, where there are so many people participating in such a variety of roles that could all possibly make legitimate intellectual property claims. Similarly, on the technology side, when a wide variety of tools, many of them commercial, many of them proprietary, many of them integrating, third-party data, and so forth, that just really makes all of this quite difficult. So a pretty daunting task that we set out for ourselves, but mainly through the cooperation of the wider community that were convened in a variety of very engaged focus groups. We like to think that we've made really excellent progress that has been encapsulated in the white paper that Anne referred to. And it's just, if you wanted a direct link to that, it is right here. There's also indirect links from some of the other URLs that we passed along already. Next slide, please, Anne. So as a result of all of that work, there are a series of recommendations that are included as a large proportion of the white paper. There are over 50 in a variety of categories, including sort of general principles for architectural preservation, then more specific recommendations having to do with questions of formats, both for acquiring materials, for requesting materials, if that is if there's an opportunity for doing that, potentially for normalizing things to streamline subsequent preservation activity. Metadata, this material is just in such a bewildering amount, number of source formats. Many, of course, especially nowadays in the digital realm, were things that you might not initially think were certainly perhaps never originally intended for architectural or engineering practice, but have proven to be quite useful. So that's an interesting thing. Data packaging, how things should be packaged up for transfer to an appropriate preservation authority. Anne mentioned the vital role that software plays here, so that we really cannot end our attention with the data objects themselves. We have to also have a plan in place for ensuring the continued availability or access to appropriate software that is in many cases absolutely fundamentally necessary to unlock the information content that would otherwise be buried in what are often opaque and proprietary data formats. How is anyone going to know that this material exists? Where to go to get it? Under what sort of terms can this material be made available? And that, of course, takes us into a number of recommendations in the legal area. Some of the key findings that we could highlight here, a lot more detail in these other documents. First of all, we are recommending that design artifacts need to be captured at a variety of major stages in their life cycle, starting as early as the original creative brief that might be given to a designer or design firms. There are initial conceptual design partie, various iterations, certainly at the point where there might be a relatively final, a set of requirements in terms of a project bid, the construction bid, and then very importantly, what was the actual as-built form. So it's, of course, all of these are recommendations, and many of them might be difficult to fulfill in the context of any particular project, but we thought it was very important to try to capture this creative evolution of design information. This is particularly important for purposes of architectural history and architectural education. I think it is very important for students to be early on to be able to look at the evolutionary process that goes in to the making of what might be very, very well known or important pieces of built architecture. We are recommending that design artifacts should always be acquired in their original native format, as well as in the widest variety of derivatives. The more variant representations that are available, that just betters our chances in being able to ensure that at least some subset of those copies will remain viable over time. Of course, anytime you create a derivative, there's the possibility that you are losing some amount of data. I mean, it is one thing to have a BIM, the richest possible representation. That could always be flattened out into sort of static PDF representations of various slices of that information. The PDF, quite frankly, is probably going to be easier to deal with over archival time spans because it's a well-known constrained format. But of course, all you're getting is snapshots of a much larger totality. So just because we're asking for the derivatives does not mean that we're not going to hopefully develop techniques over time for dealing with those native forms. But again, it is a way of minimizing our overall risk. Of course, all of this data needs to be accompanied by the fullest possible metadata, whether it's descriptive, intellectual, technical, structural, and so forth, or contextual. That's another really big one that we probably should have highlighted here on this slide. What we found, particularly in interviews with the local firms that we were dealing with, is that to really get the full picture of what this data means, you have to absolutely understand the context in which it was created, the context in which it was intended to be used, the context in which it was actually used, which may be actually slightly different than the original intention. It's, as I mentioned, we've emphasized this already, we need to make provision for persistent availability of the software necessary to render and manipulate these design artifacts. And we can certainly go into a little bit more detail about a couple of very promising avenues that are now open through software emulation that really makes this goal a lot easier than it was, previously. And then finally, we have working with some folks at the Harvard Law School, and particularly their cyber law clinic, where we're working with both clinicians and students. We were able to develop some draft language that we think could play a very important role in being added to standardized contracts that might adhere between a patron and a firm, as well as a language that can be inserted into donor agreements, all of which makes very, very explicit that in addition to whatever rights may be present and who may hold them and where things may flow, that we are trying to stake out the ability of responsible people to transfer this information to an appropriate preservation program for long-term care and stewardship. Next slide, please, Anne. And Sarah, is this where I'm supposed to hand back to you? I can't quite recall.
Yes.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Rogers. I'm the digital archivist at the Graduate School of Design. So I work pretty closely with Anne and Stephen on all of this. As Anne mentioned, we did have this really great opportunity to speak to two local firms about their files and about how they conceptualize the creation of these files. And we had initially planned to do these two pilot projects to kind of work with the firms to sort of document that workflow of preparing and transferring the files to a potential repository. Unfortunately, with the pandemic coinciding with the beginning of that project, we had to sort of rescale and reimagine what we would be doing with those files instead. And, as priorities had to shift, unfortunately, one of the firms could no longer work with us. But luckily for us, Howler and Yoon still was willing to spend the time and energy and effort on this with us. And so we really benefited from working with them really closely. They were very generous in that they gave us the project files for one project that was currently in the process of being built, so that we could see what the most recent project files could potentially look like. And it was really great having that sort of opportunity to talk to a donor in the process of having just finished the creation of these files, right? So being able to walk through a donor survey with them while everything is still fresh in their mind was really great. And it also led to questions about the capacity for firms to do this work. Something that came up was, the time it takes to actually spend time with an archivist to go through, 30,000 files potentially, right? So that I think was a really important takeaway for us, that, you know, those conversations are really important, and it's great to have them as early as possible. You know, granted, that's not always the case for the time frame in which, you know, archives receive materials. But it was really helpful because we tried a couple of different transfer methods for different reasons. Our first approach was to just have them select files that they thought that were important in order to understand the project. But we also asked that they made sure to include Rhino, Revit, and AutoCAD files for us to really look at these files in their native software. Not only to just sort of see what that experience would be like, but just for, you know, the files that I typically work with aren't that new. So it was really helpful for me, honestly. And so they sent us about 37 files, which, you know, isn't a lot. It's like 2 gigabytes. But even in such a small set, we already could identify like areas we really need to, in these early conversations with them and doing early appraisal of this material, really need to make clear. So, you know, the data packaging was something that came up really quickly. We were unable to open the Revit file initially, and so we had to go back to the donor and see what that problem was. And even they weren't able to figure it out, so we had to just get a new version of that file. You know, really like things we talk about a lot, but then, you know, when you open an Adobe file and all the fonts are messed up, that was obviously another one that came up. And so that was really helpful. And I think it gave the donor a sense of kind of, you know, what it was we are really looking for when we take these files in. So we did an actual second transfer, and this was us asking them to give us everything that they felt comfortable with at the time. So we sent them an external drive, and I walked them through the process of packaging everything and sending it to us. And this ended up being significantly larger. It was 243 gigabytes, which turned out to be about 28,000 files. And to think about this being just one project, as we, you know, scale out, that's quite a lot of files. And, you know, as Stephen mentioned, you know, this was a variety of formats that were present. You know, it was quite a lot to look at. But also what was really kind of great to see was how well organized it was. You know, firms have had to tackle this issue much earlier than maybe some other professions, in that, you know, because they're constantly referring to these files, because multiple people are working with them, it's really in their best interest to have like standards in place within their firm. And so having a sense, just in talking to the donor, what those standards were, it was really easy to identify how they were arranging materials within the design phases. You know, we were able to also then map them to what we were sort of expecting to see in relation to the design phases, and what that, like, the digital output of that might be. And so that was really great. Let's see, what else? I will say that it was really valuable with the grant. We were actually able to have 2 students from the GSD work with us. And that was really helpful in understanding what we have and what we don't. The student who was working with me had previously worked in a firm in the very particular task of preparing materials to send to an archive, and immediately was able to say, like, oh, I expected to see this, but it wasn't there. And so we were able to, you know, reach out to the donor, and they were like, oh, I didn't think that would be of interest, but here it is. Like, and so I think that kind of, you know, connection with students is really helpful for us here. But, you know, obviously we would want to figure out a way to sort of document that knowledge and to share it out, so that it is clear what it is that we should be receiving. Yeah, and we were also able to look at some of the open source viewers with mixed results, because that was a question that we had too. Like, you know, Stephen mentioned like the dependency of the software, like even just to view them, what is useful, and, you know, what won't do what it is that a researcher might be interested in seeing. which of course, leads to questions of access, which was something we were hoping to address, but, with the time frame, it's something that we definitely recommend for future work, and it's exploring access, not only in understanding how to provide access to researchers potentially, but something I found really interesting was our student looked at some older files with me from the early 2000s, and just conceptually the way that they were doing work then versus now was so different to her, even as a practitioner, that in the future that will be an issue for like public services and in our archival space. But yeah, I guess all I had really for my takeaways. I obviously would love to talk about this and could talk about this for a while. So if you could go to the next slide, Anne. So in thinking about, this conversation, this opportunity to speak with you all, we developed some questions around sort of some of the recommendations we had, and some guidelines that we had created in thinking about how to carry on this work and how to collaborate specifically with the design record section. So I don't know if Anne, you wanted to start some of this, or?
Sure. So when we write deeds of gift at Harvard, at the GSD, we've learned that we often have to, not often, but well, sometimes we have to alter our standard donor gift agreement, because our standard agreement is, I, the donor, turn over all the rights to this archive to the school, or the president and fellows of Harvard College, just to be specific. But we also, as we work with donors who are still practicing, we've developed another template, if you will, that's about, I'll give my rights to Harvard, and Harvard will license back the rights for me to use these materials for my lifetime. So that's a second kind of template we've developed. And part of what we were trying to do too with the Berkman Klein Center is to develop, could we develop a template that could be used by many institutions, knowing that you will still have to alter it somewhat? And is it feasible to get a sort of standardized template accepted in lots of different institutions? And can we also work with the AIA to get contract language into their suite of contracts, so that we get architects and other designers to start thinking about, my work could be going to a repository in the future. And if they start thinking about those issues from the beginning, it could help all of us as collecting institutions and facilities managers and all of that going down the road. So that's, if that is something that, would it be useful to work together to create different types of templates for different use cases? Is this something SAA could provide its Imprimatur for donor templates? And so that's one of the questions that we were thinking about. And we could start with that, or we could go through all of them, but it might be interesting to have a little discussion about each one before going to the next. Moira, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so, because at least we'll hopefully touch on all of the different aspects that you guys are interested in. And if anybody has any questions along the way, definitely this is, we're encouraging this as a conversational format. So please jump in or use the chat box if you have a comment that you'd like to add or a question. So just to get started on this first one with the deed of gift, Allison, I don't know if in your institution, do you guys use that more? As a facilities archivist, we don't, here at MIT, we don't use the deed of gift very often because we're purchasing records from the architect or whoever is providing them. So I don't have a lot of firsthand experience with the deed of gift, but Allison, I believe that you're working on more of like a standard like architectural collection. So I don't know if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, we have been doing that, I think, to some extent, really for years. I think it started with Venturi Scott Brown, because we started taking in their archives in like, I think the agreement, the conversation started in the 90s, and then it started coming in the early 2000s. And so there was always the idea that, you know, there's a kind of co-write to using the material. So it's actually, you know, and we've done that with other firms, you know, because we've taken them later that are still active. The one thing I would comment on, you know, after seeing how it works when you have such a long relationship with architects, is now we're at the point where there's a lot of confusion from researchers over who they ask for what, and then sometimes disagreements over what we can give people access to. Like it's a little messy. I don't know if there's any better approach though, because of course, you know, if you're still working and you produce the work like these architects do, they're going to want to use it how they see fit. But then it puts us in a funny situation where sometimes things that we should maybe make fully accessible to researchers, we need to hold back. So, yeah. But donor relations are always complicated.
They are. We've had similar situations, Allison, and some of it we try to codify in the deed of gift if we can, because we're trying to make it really explicit at the beginning. We've had some conversations recently about who gets the right to allow people to use content from the archive if the donor still has access to it. And we've been trying to put that in the gift agreement, so it's very clear how it can be divided and for how long a term that can happen. But that's a negotiation process, right?
Yeah.
So Anne, at the second part of your paragraph here about SAA providing it, I'm sorry, I'm like tripping over my words today. The
Imprimatur?
Thank you. Thank you. It's one of those days for me, for the donor templates. So but how would you envision that working? Is that something you can explain a little more?
Well, I think it's in our minds. So I don't know if SAA does this, but I know that they support best practices and things. And I guess our idea is that if SAA could sort of codify and agree that these templates are something that they would promote and back up, it might make it easier for collecting institutions when their internal constituents. SAA has approved these, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Kind of like best practices, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I think that's definitely something, to me, that would be something that we would discuss at like our annual meeting, for instance, kind of like going over that and getting people's input for that. So the next one of those is going to be over the summer, probably in July or August. So I'm happy to add that to our list of topics we want to cover, if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you. I don't know if I can't see everybody because I'm screen sharing. So I don't know if other people have thoughts about the donor agreement topic.
Give people a minute to chime in if they're interested. Okay. And if anybody has any further questions, they have any thoughts about this after the fact, they can always get into contact with Allison and I through the Design Records Section email, which we'll put in the chat, and we can forward that information on to the Building for Tomorrow team as well. So if there's something that pops up, you know, later on today or in the next week or two that you want to continue the conversation about, we can definitely do that.
Great.
So I figured I'd speak up before this. I'm in a similar situation as Mara, where I'm kind of more in a business archive, but we're redeveloping our professional services agreements with purchasing. So even though it's not a donor agreement, I think we can definitely contribute or have those conversations on like best practices for not just the donor, but also kind of the files that are being created today.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Do you want to move on to the next
Sure.
working point?
Yeah, I
Um,
can take the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to me to understand how other archivists are spending time with donors in relation to transfers. You know, one of our recommendations that had come out of the November meeting we had with a group of stakeholders was to create like a transfer checklist. So that it was very clear like what needs to come over. But obviously we work in such different types of repositories with sort of different missions too. So there would be maybe a need for multiple use cases, right? So yeah, I was just curious about how people are doing, how spending time with donors, how they're doing appraisal for born digital design files. I just read recently, of course, the special collections appraisal tool, the design records appraisal tool, I guess. The essay that Eliza and Jody and Allison and Sarah and Andy, all of you who I think a lot of you are here, recently wrote. And like, I love this idea of the grid. And so I was curious if people had opportunity to utilize that in their own work yet, and how, they've sort of mapped that to digital design files, if they've done that yet.
Jody or Eliza, would either of you like to chime in? I'm not sure if you've had anybody use this yet. I know that's something that we talked about looking at in the future.
Sure. Go
for it. Go for it, Jody.
Okay, I was just, I actually have used it really with a donor because it was an architect getting ready to retire and he was a bit overwhelmed when I was trying to explain this to him, but showing him the article, he said it helped immensely to know what we were looking for. And then also looking at the different, like looking at, of course, special collections, but looking from it with a firm's perspective as well. And so I've at least been able to use this, and it was definitely a great tool.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt anyone.
No, go ahead, Kristen.
So yeah, hi, I work at the Perk at Harvard, and Allison and I were just chatting, and so there are tools out there that we use. I haven't used the grid, I've seen the grid. Allison Anderson showed it to me, and it looks really great. But we use Reference Manager and AutoCAD just to make sure all the CADs are bound. That's a really big problem that we have. Is that when I'm appraising, I'm facilities too, but when I'm appraising, because I do the digital appraisal. Often they'll send me a lot of material, but they'll even send me the files that I can bind to, but they don't have them in the right places, so I can't bind it. So then I do end up going back to architects sometimes to get new material. But I think that, that's an important thing to incorporate. CADs have to be bound. It's really important, otherwise they're not always usable. We also use a bridge to check to make sure that our TIFF files are 300 DPI or above, so that can be properly deposited and used later. Just those kinds of standards that like architects don't think about. So really early outreach is important, but also just knowing that there are tools out there that you can use to make sure that you have your digital material at the level that you need it in order to do proper preservation. And maybe a list of what those are. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And it's something I think about in thinking about the difference between like facilities and like an academic repository is like you are looking at those files immediately upon receiving them. And yeah, to be able to like maybe have those relationships with donors happen earlier, rather than the end of someone's career, like, or, having this information to give to firms so that's something that they're working toward as they, move their files around and within their own IT infrastructure.
I think that's really important. And that was the thing I was wondering when you talked about earlier in the presentation, speaking with AIA or with firms, just kind of like getting it out there somehow, like, hey, if you really want this stuff to live on, and if you really want to actually be able to use it within your firm 10 years from now, here are some standards that we know, make it so that things are more easily maybe opened in at least, through some sort of simulation or something, even if not, like I can't open an R14 CAD, but if it's properly preserved and at the right, at least bound, I have a much better chance than if it were unbound, a bunch of files kind of floating all over the place.
Yeah, it does seem like outreach is a key component of getting, because you guys have done such impressive work, really. Like when I was reading through the white paper, it was very, very interesting to me and really relevant to what I think a lot of people are facing with design records. And I think that that outreach component is very important, just to get both archivists who are working with these things, but also the people creating them, and the vendors that are creating that software that the people creating them are using. You know, it's really, that's key to getting this to move forward. So one thing I was thinking about was, I know that you had mentioned you did speak with some vendors about like their, you know, perception of this and how they, you know, how they see themselves serving like the architectural community. So one thing you had mentioned in the white paper, I think, was that they see a PDF as being the record document, and that's, you know, that's what you should keep, like the be all end all sort of. But obviously we know that as archivists, we want to keep like a more rounded file, and perhaps keep the, you know, the BWG, whatever it is, whatever other more in-depth files we have. So I didn't know if you got any sense from them about how much of an appetite they had for making that more realistic. Like Kristen was just saying, like we frequently get files without the extra bound and so forth, and it creates so many issues, you know. And unless you're like immediately like reviewing those files and making sure that every single one, and these days it can be thousands, have everything bound and is working correctly, then, you know, you could be a few years down the road before you realize that you're missing like key components. So I guess I'm kind of like going in a circle here, but I didn't know if the vendors did give you any feedback about that, or if they were just sort of wanting to go towards the PDF as like the only record format. And something else in addition to that, I was thinking about, at least in construction, we see a lot of files coming to us from construction software like Procore or eBuilder. And I was wondering if that might also be a good place, because they're already collecting all the records there, if that might also be a good place to, you know, try and get them to kind of enact some of these best practices that we're talking about. And it's kind of a giant question. So does anybody want to take a bite out of it?
Well, okay, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, we have had some conversations with vendors, and I know Anne's has been doing this for a long time. I've been involved in this in a larger context. It is, you know, often the people that we are tending to talk with, who tend to be more sort of in middle management, you know, they say yes, but, you know, by the time it filters up to upper leadership, you know, questions get asked and things slow down. You never get a definitive no, but things always slow down. The fact is that we in the memory, you know, institutional world, we are so small and we're such a niche that we really have very little bargaining power. What we've discussed, you know, amongst ourselves is that we need to sort of, I think, it's better to approach the vendor community through the practitioner community. They're the people that they're going to listen to, because they're the ones who are buying things. So if we can convince them that this is, well, we don't have to convince them. They know that this is important for their own purposes. They don't always have the resources available to do what they want to do. But, you know, if they can make, you know, and maybe making a more concerted approach through, you know, professional organizations such as AIA, that I think is the way that will be more likely to get a more positive response.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think that also ties into one of your later points here about instruction opportunities. And I love that in the white paper, you guys talked about design students and getting them sort of acclimated to this idea early on. And, you know, I think you said you also spoke with some of the firms who were hiring these students and then having to train them themselves. And I think that one of the things you wanted to touch on was creating some modules for training purposes. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are a few of us on this meeting, actually. A small group of us have had maybe 2 whole conversations, right? So our first approach is actually thinking about trying to get into conversations with those who teach practice in the design schools, because that's where we're going to get the most traction. And so our idea was to talk to those faculty in our own institutions and then compare our notes, and then to start identifying where can we work with the faculty as part of that part of the curriculum. Because I think as librarians, we do a lot of teaching about data management as a thing, but I think doing it within the context of the class and then also supplementing it the way we do in our usual teaching would be most effective. So we're eager to have others work with us if you're interested. I think we all have some ideas, but we haven't. Well, first of all, I should also say our goal is to not make any of these asks for anybody's time into, this is not a grant funded project, so there's not a time delineation thing. We all are incredibly busy. So if we can take little chunks off and do a little bit at a time, we can make some progress together, just for those who worry about their time like we all do, because we're all way too busy already. But we're engaged. We want to engage you and work with you, but also be respectful of everybody's time availability.
And do you, I know we're getting a little short on time here. So do you want to also talk about the preservation analysis component here? And then we can kind of see if there's any wrap up questions that people want to get in.
Sure. So very quickly, I want to hear you. You probably don't want to hear me anymore. What we're interested in doing here is to make sure that we're dealing with the most expansive understanding of the scope of the range of target material, both primary data and software that we need to work with. Obviously, we tried to do all our work as expansively and open-ended as we can, and we were glad that we had participation of a lot of outside people. But everything we do is colored by our own experience and what we've seen. And while there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of outliers that are particular to any institution. So, I mean, just in this past half hour, 45 minutes, I've heard a couple of new acronyms that I wasn't even familiar with for some data types, particularly in the construction area. The more we understand the full range, then the better we can craft policies and procedures that are going to work in the largest number of cases. Questions of metadata, how well do existing metadata standards work? In many cases, these things were developed, at least initially, to deal with tangible materials. How good are they at being applied into the digital realm? What's missing? What may need to be added there? The software side, we've talked about this a lot already. One of the things that we uncovered in our interviews is that it is very important to try to capture the very, very specific software dependency. It's not just the name of the tool. You need to know the specific version, the specific build, because there's often very poor backwards compatibility, and there's often a very narrow slice when anything earlier, anything later may not work fully appropriately. Another question we have here is, to what extent do you see trends shifting from sort of desktop deployment of software to cloud deployment of software, which is really going to complicate things. At least on the desktop, you actually have something, even if you're keeping a copy under a fair use argument. But with the cloud thing, you don't have anything. It's completely it's in the cloud. So again, that really highlights the necessity of being able to get the cooperation of the vendor community.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I know something we're concerned about always is for older files, trying to force them to open in a newer version of a piece of software, or even like some kind of like, you know, saving it back or something. And what data are we losing? And it's hard to tell sometimes, like if you know, if you're losing pertinent data for that. So, I mean, at least from our perspective, like where I'm working right now, and I think this is probably applicable for a lot of people, that they're facing these software contracts, you know, where it's like, they just, you know, you're automatically being updated all the time. And you can't just like keep that, that old software somewhere. So I think that's part of what you were mentioning with the cloud and then that kind of access. So that's something I'd be interested to hear more about if anybody has any experience with that or questions about that. Or any of these other points, if anybody wants to jump in, the floor is open.
For Moira, for the topic of cloud computing, that's something that comes up a lot for the cross collaboration, and especially when the software is being hosted by something like an AWS, there's a lot of additional complications. I was doing some interviews for the DPC report Jody and I just finished writing last year, that's currently in membership review, but should be public to everyone this summer. And several people talked about how they have software that they've devised that if the server updates, it could change how their software works, and they would have no way of telling you that that happened, and they also have no way of documenting that that's happened. And I'm watching Stephen's face because yeah, there's nothing else to do but smile at this, because what you know, it's the world of uncertainty, and that's going back to the larger conversation of the two-prong approach. We have past created material and future created material, and in the past the potential for data loss is very real and already felt, and the future has even more of that. And the thing that's really remarkable about the design community is they're pretty much okay with it, and we're not okay with it as archival community because we don't understand what's been lost. But the designers themselves are often able to say, oh, I'll just remake that, or I can pick this up and there's enough breadcrumbs here for me as a super user to recreate this. And so this is a two-pronged problem that we all have to face at the same time, because no institution saying I'm only looking at 2000 and earlier, and other institutions saying we'll take care of the rest. You know, none of us have that as our collecting scope. But the issue of the cloud computing is a really challenging one. And even though companies like Autodesk have done a wonderful job documenting, Shan Hurley's blog, if you don't follow it, is phenomenal. But it does a wonderful job of showing what the versions are. But when you get into the cloud, you can't save down. You can't save down those versions in the same way that you can't document whether or not someone used the VR simulation button in Revit for momentary viewing and then closed it. There's not a record there. And so that's where those interviews become really helpful. And we as a profession need to figure out what is our comfort level with loss and how do we articulate that so that we're not over promising to researchers that you're getting the full experience, because fundamentally they're not going to.
Eliza, thanks for that very last point about figuring out what we'll accept as loss and setting expectations for researchers. That's a really excellent point.
Okay, so we have, I'm sorry, go ahead, Katie.
Oh, I was just going to make a point too, that it's interesting to think about, because there's always been loss, right? Like as we collected paper-based artifacts as well, it's always been partial. So maybe we just need to start rethinking what part are we okay with not having, or how do we identify and document that there are pieces that it's still always going to be fragments. They're just different fragments than it would have been 20 years ago or 50 years ago.
Well, actually, that brings up another point that I think about a lot with this, which is about your collecting scope. Because clearly, if a project has 30,000 files, at some point, people run out of digital space for actually collecting all this material. So I think that that's another thing to think about, is how are we going to come up with collection development policies for these institutions that actually make sense? And I guess it depends on obviously depends on who your users are. But if you're, say, we have a very sort of finite collection development policy because we are a facilities archive and our users are architects and engineers that are building buildings at Harvard. But as a research institution, you might have to decide that there are certain aspects of, say, I'm not sure, like the conceptual phase or certain procedural things that you just can't keep. You can't keep a million. I mean, this is the problem with the internet in general, right? Like if you have everything, you have nothing. Like that sort of idea, like, and how are you going to kind of wrap people's heads around that and decide what really matters?
So I am so sad that we are coming to the end of our hour here because I feel like we have a lot more conversation to have. And Sarah and Stephen, is there any way that would you prefer people reach out to you directly? Do you want them to get in touch with us through the SAA email, and then we can forward information to you if they have any thoughts beyond what we've already talked about today?
I'm fine either way, whatever is easiest for people. And thanks, Sarah, for that plug for our document. You can also do it via the document. And we promise not to make a lot of work for people.
Yeah,
Just
I'll probably
little expertise in little chunks, right?
Yeah, I'll probably transition this document to being something that can be worked on asynchronously. So yeah, just feel free to use that link to add anything that comes up later. And you know, for people who are viewing this later, feel free to contribute as well.
Thank you for having us.
Oh no, thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I hope that maybe we can continue this conversation on in some other way so that we can continue to get to the meat of this because it's really important for design archivists and the community in general. So I really appreciate you guys trying to take this on. It's amazing. And I think that there should be some opportunities for the Design Records section to help and you know, do what we can to support you. So
great. Thank
all
you.
right.
Thanks,
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good to see everyone.
Bye,
Bye, guys.
everybody.
Bye.